This dramatization is based on real events, but some details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The purpose is educational, showing how seemingly minor conflicts can escalate when dialogue and understanding are abandoned. In the shadows of American cities where legitimate business intersects with underground networks, ordinary families sometimes find themselves caught in webs they never knew existed. This is the story of Marcus Chen, a mechanical engineer from Cleveland, Ohio, whose world shattered when his 19-year-old daughter Sarah disappeared after inadvertently crossing paths with the fictional Rossi organization, a deeply entrenched criminal network operating in the industrial corridors of the Midwest. What follows is not a tale of revenge or vigilante justice, but rather an exploration of how desperation can transform an ordinary man into something unrecognizable. Through interviews with law enforcement officials, community members, and those who knew the Chen family, we piece together a story of institutional failure, bureaucratic paralysis, and the psychological toll of navigating a world where official channels offer no recourse. This documentary examines the human cost of organized crime's presence in American communities, the limitations of law enforcement in combating entrenched criminal enterprises, and the devastating choices faced by those who find themselves outside the protection of traditional justice systems. It's a story about a father's love, the corruption of innocence, and the price of seeking answers in a world governed by silence and fear. The following account has been reconstructed from police reports, witness testimonies, and extensive interviews conducted over 2 years of investigation into events that forever changed one family and exposed the hidden networks that operate beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. Marcus Chen had always believed that hard work and honesty were enough to protect his family. At 42, he was a senior mechanical engineer at Cleveland's Midwest Manufacturing, a man who measured his success not in dollars, but in the stability he provided for his wife, Linda, and their daughter, Sarah. Their modest home in the Tremont neighborhood represented everything he valued: community, safety, and the quiet dignity of middle-class American life. The Chen family's routine was predictable in the best possible way. Marcus left for work each morning at 7:15, coffee in hand, kissing Linda goodbye as she prepared for her shift at university hospitals. Sarah, 19, and in her second year at Cleveland State University studying graphic design, usually slept until 9, her artistic schedule allowing for later starts. Their evening dinners were sacred, phones away, conversation flowing easily between Sarah's college adventures, Linda's hospital stories, and Marcus's updates from the manufacturing floor. This comfortable predictability made Sarah's absence on October 15th all the more jarring. When Marcus arrived home that Thursday evening to find Sarah's car missing and her bed unslept in, concern crept into his chest like cold water. Linda, finishing a double shift, shared his worry via phone, but suggested reasonable explanations. Perhaps Sarah was staying with her roommate Jessica, or had gotten caught up in a late study session at the university library. By Friday morning, concern had transformed into genuine alarm. Sarah's phone went straight to voicemail, her professors hadn't seen her in classes, and Jessica reported that Sarah had never arrived at their planned Thursday afternoon coffee meeting. The last confirmed sighting was Wednesday evening, when she'd left her part-time job at Artisan Coffee, a trendy shop in the Ohio City district where she worked 3 afternoons a week to supplement her college expenses. Marcus filed a missing person report that Friday afternoon, sitting across from Detective Ray Kowalski at the 3rd District Police Station. The detective, a 20-year veteran with graying temples and tired eyes, took the report with professional courtesy but little urgency. 19-year-old college student, Kowalski explained. 9 times out of 10, they show up in a couple days with a story about staying with friends or taking an impromptu trip. We'll put out the alert, check with local hospitals, but honestly, Mr. Chen, most of these cases resolve themselves. The weekend stretched endlessly. Marcus and Linda canvassed Sarah's usual haunts, the coffee shop where she worked, the art supply stores she frequented, the small venues where local bands played, and Sarah sometimes went with friends. They created flyers with Sarah's photo, her warm smile and dark eyes staring out from hundreds of copies they posted on telephone poles and bulletin boards throughout the city. The image showed her at last month's family barbecue, wearing a Cleveland Indians t-shirt and laughing at something her cousin had said. It was the Sarah they knew, vibrant, optimistic, completely unaware that danger could touch their carefully constructed world. On Monday, Marcus returned to work, but found concentration impossible. His colleagues noticed his distraction, offering sympathetic words and practical help. His supervisor, recognizing the gravity of the situation, granted him indefinite family leave. By Wednesday, with still no word from Sarah, Marcus had effectively abandoned any pretense of normal life. He spent his days driving through Cleveland's neighborhoods, stopping at businesses to show Sarah's photo, asking questions that seemed to lead nowhere. The first real lead came from an unexpected source. Maria Gonzalez, a server at Romano's Italian restaurant in Little Italy, recognized Sarah's photo immediately. "She was here last Wednesday night," Maria told Marcus, her accent thick with concern. "Beautiful girl, very polite. She was asking questions about someone, a man named Vincent, I think. She showed me a picture on her phone, asked if I'd seen him around the neighborhood." This information puzzled Marcus deeply. Sarah had never mentioned knowing anyone named Vincent, and her interest in Little Italy had been purely academic. She'd visited the area occasionally for its historic architecture and vibrant street art, subjects that appealed to her artistic sensibilities. Why would she be looking for someone there, and why hadn't she mentioned this search to her family? Detective Kowalski showed more interest when Marcus reported this development, but his response remained frustratingly measured. "Could be nothing," the detective said, making notes in his case file. "Maybe she was working on some kind of school project or helping a friend find someone. We'll check with the restaurant, see if anyone else remembers her or this Vincent character." The investigation, such as it was, seemed to move at a pace that Marcus found unbearably slow. Days passed with no updates, no new leads, no sense that authorities were treating Sarah's disappearance with the urgency that consumed every moment of his waking life. Marcus began conducting his own investigation, returning repeatedly to Little Italy, showing Sarah's photo in every shop and restaurant, asking questions that seemed to make some people uncomfortable. It was during one of these solo visits that Marcus first encountered the wall of silence that would come to define his search. At Benedetti's grocery, an elderly Italian man behind the counter studied Sarah's photo for a long moment before shaking his head. "No, never seen her," he said, but something in his expression suggested otherwise. When Marcus pressed gently, mentioning that Sarah had been asking about someone named Vincent, the man's demeanor shifted noticeably. "Look, friend," he said quietly, glancing toward the back of the store. "Sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions around here. Some families, they value their privacy very much." This cryptic warning lodged itself in Marcus's mind like a splinter. The phrase, "some families," carried weight that he couldn't quite understand, but the implication was clear. There were people in this neighborhood who commanded a respect born of fear, not affection. The realization that Sarah might have stumbled into something dangerous sent cold dread through his system, but it also provided the first concrete direction his search had taken in 2 weeks. Marcus began researching Little Italy's history, learning about its transformation from a vibrant immigrant community into a more complex neighborhood where legitimate businesses operated alongside establishments that seemed to cater to a more exclusive clientele. The Rossi name appeared frequently in his research, not in criminal contexts, but in business registrations, property ownership records, and charitable organization documents. On the surface, the Rossi family appeared to be successful entrepreneurs who had helped revitalize the neighborhood through strategic investments and community involvement. The deeper Marcus dug, however, the more questions arose. Why did so many businesses in Little Italy share common ownership structures that led back to Rossi-affiliated companies? Why did local news articles about neighborhood disputes or business conflicts often mention that matters had been resolved privately without police involvement? Most troubling of all, why did the mention of Vincent's name in connection with Sarah's search seem to make people so uncomfortable? 3 weeks after Sarah's disappearance, Marcus received a call that would change everything. Detective Kowalski's voice was carefully neutral as he delivered the news. "Mr. Chen, we found your daughter's car. It was abandoned in a parking lot in Lakewood, about 15 miles from where she was last seen. The vehicle appears undisturbed. Her purse is still inside with credit cards and cash untouched. We're processing it for evidence now." The location made no sense. Lakewood was a suburban community west of Cleveland, with no connection to Sarah's usual activities or known associates. The fact that her car had been deliberately placed there, rather than stolen or damaged, suggested something far more sinister than a random crime or teenage rebellion. Someone had wanted her car found, but only after enough time had passed for other evidence to disappear. Standing in the police parking lot, looking at Sarah's blue Honda Civic surrounded by evidence tape, Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him. The car looked exactly as Sarah had left it, her coffee cup still in the holder, her graphic design textbooks stacked neatly on the passenger seat, her phone charger coiled in the door pocket. But Sarah herself was gone, vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Detective Kowalski approached with a clear plastic evidence bag containing Sarah's cell phone. "Found this under the driver's seat," he said. "Looks like someone tried to make sure it wouldn't be found easily. We're having our tech people examine it, but the battery's been dead for weeks. Might take some time to recover any useful data." That night, Marcus sat in Sarah's empty bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of her interrupted life. Her art supplies lay scattered across her desk, exactly as she'd left them. Charcoal pencils, sketch pads filled with architectural drawings and portrait studies, color swatches for a project she would never complete. On her bulletin board, photos of friends mixed with inspiration images clipped from design magazines, creating a collage that spoke to dreams and ambitions that now seemed frozen in time. Linda found him there at dawn, still sitting in Sarah's desk chair, staring at a half-finished sketch of the city skyline. "The police will find her," she said, though her voice carried more hope than conviction. "They have procedures, resources, connections we don't have. We have to trust the system." But Marcus was beginning to understand that the system had limitations, especially when it came to investigating people who commanded the kind of respect that silenced witnesses and made even long-time residents uncomfortable about answering simple questions. If Sarah had somehow become entangled with the wrong people in Little Italy, the conventional investigation approaches might prove inadequate to the challenge of bringing her home. As October gave way to November, Marcus made a decision that would define the remainder of his life. If the official investigation couldn't or wouldn't pursue every possible lead, he would conduct his own. He would learn everything there was to know about the Rossi family and their associates. He would understand the unspoken rules that governed Little Italy's business relationships, and he would find his daughter, no matter what it cost him. The man who had always believed in working within the system was about to discover just how far outside it he was willing to go. November brought an early cold snap to Cleveland, but Marcus Chen barely noticed the changing weather. His world had contracted to a single focus, understanding the network that had swallowed his daughter. What began as desperate searches through Sarah's belongings had evolved into something more systematic, a methodical investigation that consumed 18 hours of each day and left him hollow-eyed but determined. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While examining Sarah's laptop for any clues the police might have missed, Marcus discovered a folder titled Art History Research that contained dozens of photographs she had taken around Little Italy. Most were architectural studies, the ornate facades of century-old buildings, intricate stonework details, decorative elements that spoke to the neighborhood's rich immigrant heritage. But scattered among these artistic images were photos that suggested a different purpose entirely. Sarah had been documenting patterns of activity around specific businesses. The timestamps on her photos revealed multiple visits to the same locations over several weeks, capturing the same storefronts at different times of day. Romano's restaurant appeared repeatedly, but so did Benedetti's grocery, Caruso's auto repair, and a business called Eastside Imports that seemed to have no visible signage or regular customers. The photos showed these establishments during both busy periods and quiet moments, almost as if Sarah had been studying their operational rhythms. Most intriguing was a series of photos taken from different angles of a building on Mayfield Road that housed what appeared to be a private social club. The brass nameplate by the entrance read, Società Italiana di Cleveland, and Sarah had captured images of men entering and leaving the building, always well-dressed, always arriving in expensive cars. The final photo in the series, taken just 3 days before her disappearance, showed a man in his early 30s with dark hair and sharp features, standing beside a black Mercedes sedan. Sarah had zoomed in on this individual, suggesting he was the subject of particular interest. Marcus printed every photo and began constructing a timeline of Sarah's activities. Her visits to Little Italy hadn't been random or purely academic. She had been conducting surveillance, though for what purpose remained unclear. The systematic nature of her documentation suggested someone had taught her these techniques, or that she was gathering information for someone else. But who would ask a 19-year-old college student to investigate organized crime figures? And why would Sarah agree to such a dangerous assignment? The answer came from Jessica Martinez, Sarah's roommate, during Marcus's 4th conversation with her. Initially, Jessica had insisted she knew nothing about Sarah's activities beyond normal college life. But as the weeks passed and Sarah's absence became undeniably permanent rather than temporary, Jessica's resolve began to crack. Finally, sitting in the student union cafeteria with tears streaming down her face, she revealed the truth that changed everything. "There was this guy," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tony something. Sarah met him at that coffee shop where she worked. He was older, maybe 25, really charming and sophisticated. Said he was a freelance journalist working on a story about organized crime in Cleveland. He convinced Sarah that she could help him by taking pictures around Little Italy, gathering information about certain people and businesses." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach as Jessica continued. "Sarah thought it was exciting, like being an undercover reporter. Tony told her she was perfect for it because she was young and innocent-looking, that people wouldn't suspect her of anything. He gave her specific instructions about what to photograph and when. Said he would protect her if anything went wrong, that he had connections with law enforcement." The manipulation was so obvious in retrospect that Marcus wondered how he had missed the signs. Sarah's sudden interest in Italian culture, her new confidence about navigating urban environments, her mysterious afternoon absences that she explained as research projects. Someone had identified his daughter as vulnerable and exploitable, then used her trusting nature to place her directly in harm's way. "Did you ever meet this Tony?" Marcus asked, working to keep his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. Jessica shook her head. Sarah said he was very careful about security, that they only met in public places for brief conversations. She showed me his picture once, handsome guy with blonde hair and expensive clothes, but something about him made me uncomfortable. When I asked Sarah questions about his story or his background, she always had vague answers, like maybe he hadn't told her very much about himself. That evening, Marcus sat with Detective Kowalski in the police station, sharing Jessica's revelation and the photographs from Sarah's laptop. The detective studied the images with new interest, particularly the shots of the Società Italiana building and the man beside the Mercedes. "This changes things significantly," Kowalski admitted. "If your daughter was conducting surveillance on suspected organized crime figures, we're looking at a completely different scenario. The problem is, we don't know who this Tony character really is or who he might be working for. Could be legitimate journalism, could be law enforcement using unofficial sources, could be something much worse." Kowalski explained the complexities of investigating organized crime in Cleveland. The Rossi family isn't officially recognized as a criminal organization by federal authorities. They own legitimate businesses, pay taxes, contribute to charities, but there have been persistent rumors for years about their involvement in loan sharking, illegal gambling, and labor racketeering. The problem is proving it. These people are extremely sophisticated about avoiding direct criminal exposure. The detective's next words hit Marcus like a physical blow. If Sarah was gathering intelligence on them, either for this mysterious journalist or for law enforcement, And if they discovered what she was doing, then we're potentially looking at a kidnapping or worse. These aren't street criminals who act impulsively. If they felt threatened by her activities, they would respond in a calculated way designed to protect their interests. Marcus left the police station with a new understanding of his daughter's fate and his own situation. Sarah hadn't simply wandered into danger. She had been deliberately placed there by someone who used her innocence as a weapon against people who would view her surveillance as a serious threat. The question now was whether she was being held somewhere as leverage against her unknown handler, or whether the Rossi organization had already resolved the threat she represented in a more permanent way. The realization that official law enforcement channels would be insufficient became clear over the following weeks. Detective Kowalski made the appropriate inquiries, but his investigation quickly ran into the same walls of silence that had frustrated Marcus's earlier efforts. The Società Italiana claimed no knowledge of Sarah or any threats against her. The businesses she had photographed maintained they had never seen her. The man in the Mercedes, when finally identified as Vincent Rossi Jr., denied any interaction with her and provided alibis for the time frame of her disappearance. More troubling was the subtle pressure Marcus began to feel regarding his own investigation. A uniformed officer arrived at his home to check on the family's well-being and mentioned that continued visits to Little Italy might be counterproductive to the official investigation. His supervisor at Midwest Manufacturing suggested that extended family leave might impact his employment status. Even Detective Kowalski began emphasizing the importance of letting professionals handle the investigation and warned about the dangers of amateur detective work. Marcus understood the message being sent. Sarah's disappearance was inconvenient for people who preferred that certain activities remain uninvestigated. The pressure to abandon his search wasn't coming from criminal threats. It was coming from the systematic discouragement of an investigation that might expose connections between legitimate businesses and less legitimate activities. It was during this period of official obstruction that Marcus made his second crucial decision. If the system was designed to protect the people who had taken his daughter, then he would have to work outside the system. The mechanical engineer who had spent his career solving complex problems through careful analysis and methodical approaches would apply those same skills to understanding his enemies. Marcus began what he privately called his education phase. He read everything available about organized crime structure, operation, and history. He studied legal precedents involving racketeering prosecutions and learned about the evidence requirements that made such cases so difficult to build. Most importantly, he researched the specific businesses and individuals that appeared in Sarah's photographs, building detailed profiles of their activities, associations, and vulnerabilities. The Rossi family's operations were more complex and extensive than he had initially understood. Vincent Rossi Sr., the family patriarch, had immigrated from Sicily in 1975 and built a network of legitimate businesses that included restaurants, construction companies, and import operations. His sons, Vincent Jr. and Michael, had expanded into real estate development and waste management. On paper, they were successful entrepreneurs who had achieved the American dream through hard work and business acumen. But Marcus's deeper research revealed patterns that suggested a different reality. The construction companies consistently won municipal contracts, despite not always submitting the lowest bids. The waste management business operated in territories that competitors seemed reluctant to enter. Real estate developments proceeded smoothly through regulatory approval processes that typically frustrated other developers. Most telling of all, businesses that had conflicts with Rossi Enterprises often resolved those disputes quickly and quietly, sometimes selling their assets to Rossi-affiliated companies at below-market prices. The picture that emerged was of an organization that had achieved significant influence over legitimate business and government operations through a combination of economic leverage and strategic relationship building. They weren't the stereotypical gangsters of popular culture. They were sophisticated operators who understood how modern American systems could be manipulated through legal means, with illegal activities carefully hidden behind layers of legitimate operations. Understanding his enemies, however, was only the first step. Marcus also needed to understand their vulnerabilities, and that required getting closer to their operations than any official investigation could achieve. The man who had always avoided confrontation was about to learn that some problems could only be solved through direct action. The transformation began subtly. Marcus started working out regularly, not for fitness, but to build the physical confidence he would need for what was coming. He practiced surveillance techniques, learning to observe without being noticed. He studied the schedules and routines of key Rossi family members and their associates. Most importantly, he began developing relationships with people who operated on the margins of their world: bartenders, delivery drivers, construction workers who might have access to information that official investigators could never obtain. By December, Marcus had constructed a comprehensive map of the Rossi organization's operations, from their legitimate businesses to their suspected illegal activities. He knew which restaurants they used for private meetings, which construction sites might be used for activities that required privacy, which associates were trusted with sensitive responsibilities and which were expendable. He understood their communication patterns, their security procedures, and their methods for handling problems. The hardest part was accepting what this knowledge implied about Sarah's fate. If she had been discovered conducting surveillance, the Rossi organization would have faced a choice: eliminate the immediate threat while sending a message to whoever had deployed her, or find a way to turn the situation to their advantage. Either option suggested that Sarah was either dead or being held as leverage against her mysterious handler. But Marcus had also identified something else in his months of investigation. The Rossi family's greatest vulnerability was their success. They had become comfortable, confident that their combination of legitimate business operations and carefully managed illegal activities made them untouchable. They operated according to predictable patterns because those patterns had never been seriously challenged. Their security was designed to prevent law enforcement infiltration, not to stop a desperate father who was willing to sacrifice everything to find his daughter. As winter settled over Cleveland, Marcus Chen was no longer the man who had filed a missing person report 3 months earlier. The grief and desperation remained, but they had been refined into something harder and more focused. He had studied his enemies until he understood them better than they understood themselves. He had prepared for actions that the old Marcus would have considered unthinkable, and he had accepted that finding Sarah might require him to become someone that Sarah herself would not recognize. The investigation phase was ending. What came next would test every assumption the Rossi organization had about their safety, their power, and their ability to act without consequences. Marcus had learned their rules, studied their methods, and identified their weaknesses. Now he was ready to show them what happened when someone broke those rules in pursuit of something more important than their own survival. The hunter was ready to begin his work. Winter in Cleveland arrived with a brutality that matched Marcus Chen's evolving mindset. By January, 6 months had passed since Sarah's disappearance, and the official investigation had effectively stalled. Detective Kowalski still returned Marcus's calls, but their conversations had become perfunctory exercises in managing expectations rather than genuine updates on progress. The case file remained open, but Marcus understood that Sarah had joined the ranks of missing persons whose disappearances would never be officially resolved. The transformation that had begun in Marcus during his investigation phase accelerated through the dark months of winter. The methodical engineer who had once solved problems through careful analysis and systematic approaches was evolving into something far more dangerous. His research had revealed not just the structure of the Rossi organization, but also the psychological profiles of its key members, their personal vulnerabilities, and most importantly, their assumptions about how the world worked and who posed legitimate threats to their operations. Vincent Rossi Jr., the man from Sarah's photographs, had emerged as Marcus's primary focus. At 32, Vincent was being groomed to eventually take over family operations from his aging father. He lived in a sprawling house in Shaker Heights, drove expensive cars, and maintained a public image as a successful businessman with interests in real estate development and legitimate import operations. But Marcus's surveillance had revealed patterns that painted a different picture. 3 nights a week, Vincent visited a warehouse facility in the industrial district that officially belonged to Eastside Imports, but showed no signs of normal commercial activity. The building was surrounded by high fences and security cameras, and Vincent's visits always occurred after business hours, typically lasting between 2 and 4 hours. During these visits, other vehicles would arrive and depart, expensive sedans containing well-dressed men who Marcus had identified as associates from various Rossi business operations. Marcus had spent weeks studying this warehouse from different vantage points, mapping security measures and documenting activity patterns. The facility had redundant alarm systems, motion sensors, and what appeared to be reinforced doors and windows. But like all security systems, it was designed to deter certain types of threats, while leaving vulnerabilities that someone with Marcus's technical background could exploit. The warehouse represented more than just a meeting place. It was the heart of operations that required privacy and security beyond what legitimate businesses typically needed. Marcus's research suggested this was where sensitive decisions were made, where problems were discussed and resolved, and where people who threatened family interests might be brought for conversation and persuasion. If Sarah was still alive, if she was being held as leverage against her mysterious handler, this facility was the most likely location. But Marcus had also learned that direct approaches to the Rossi organization would be both futile and dangerous. These people had survived and prospered for decades by maintaining strict operational security and responding ruthlessly to threats. A missing person investigation could be stalled through legal channels and political influence, but a direct assault on their operations would trigger responses that Marcus was not yet equipped to handle. Instead, he had developed a more sophisticated strategy based on understanding the psychology of power and control that governed organized crime operations. The Rossi family's strength came from their ability to operate with impunity, to resolve problems quietly and efficiently, while maintaining their legitimate business facade. But this same strength could become a vulnerability if someone forced them to respond to problems that couldn't be resolved through their normal methods. Marcus's plan began with what he privately called peripheral pressure, actions designed to create problems that would force the organization to divert resources and attention from their core operations while simultaneously gathering intelligence about their response capabilities and decision-making processes. The goal wasn't immediate confrontation, but rather the systematic application of stress that would eventually create opportunities for more direct action. The first target was Michael Rossi's construction company, which had won several lucrative municipal contracts despite submitting bids that weren't always the most competitive. Marcus had identified the company's equipment storage yard in an industrial area near the Cuyahoga River, where expensive machinery sat unguarded during overnight hours. The facility's security was minimal, a chain-link fence and a basic alarm system that could be defeated with equipment readily available to someone with Marcus's engineering background. On a Tuesday night in late January, Marcus implemented the first phase of his campaign. Using techniques learned from months of surveillance and preparation, he gained access to the storage yard and systematically disabled 13 pieces of heavy machinery worth over $2 million. The damage wasn't random vandalism. It was precisely calculated sabotage that would require extensive repairs and create significant delays in ongoing projects. The beauty of the operation lay in its deniability and misdirection. Marcus had researched the construction company's labor disputes and identified a pattern of conflicts with union representatives over working conditions and wage negotiations. When the sabotage was discovered the next morning, the immediate assumption was that disgruntled workers or union organizers were responsible. The investigation that followed focused on labor conflicts rather than external threats, exactly as Marcus had anticipated. More importantly, the incident forced Michael Rossi to divert time and resources from normal operations to deal with the crisis. Construction schedules were disrupted, insurance claims had to be filed, and security measures at all company facilities needed to be upgraded. The psychological impact was equally significant. Someone had successfully attacked family business interests without being identified or caught, challenging assumptions about their security and control. Marcus monitored the organization's response through carefully planned surveillance of key locations and individuals. The warehouse facility where Vincent held his evening meetings showed increased activity in the days following the construction yard incident. Additional security personnel were deployed to various business locations. Most telling of all, family members began varying their personal schedules and routes, suggesting they were taking the threat seriously, despite not understanding its source or motivation. 2 weeks later, Marcus struck again, this time targeting the waste management operation that formed another pillar of the family's legitimate business empire. The company operated a fleet of specialized trucks that serviced commercial accounts throughout the greater Cleveland area. These vehicles represented significant capital investments and were essential to maintaining the contracts that generated substantial monthly revenue. Marcus's second operation was more sophisticated than the first, reflecting his growing confidence and improved understanding of his target's vulnerabilities. Rather than simple sabotage, he implemented a coordinated campaign that disabled multiple vehicles across different locations on the same night, while simultaneously triggering environmental alarms at the company's main facility. The result was operational chaos that lasted for days and required emergency response from multiple government agencies. The environmental alarm was particularly effective because it forced the company to submit to intensive inspections that revealed minor regulatory violations that had previously been overlooked. While none of these violations were serious enough to result in criminal charges, they required costly remediation and subjected the business to ongoing regulatory scrutiny that made certain activities more difficult to conceal. Marcus watched Vincent Rossi's response to this second incident with particular interest. The increased security measures implemented after the construction yard sabotage had proven insufficient to prevent the waste management attacks, suggesting that the family was dealing with a more sophisticated adversary than they had initially assumed. Security consultations were arranged, additional personnel were hired, and operational procedures were modified to reduce vulnerability to similar attacks. But the most significant response was a series of meetings at the warehouse facility that lasted longer than usual and involved participants Marcus hadn't seen before. Through careful surveillance, he identified at least 3 individuals who appeared to be security specialists or private investigators, brought in to help identify the source of the attacks. The family was taking the threat seriously enough to seek outside expertise, which suggested Marcus's campaign was achieving its intended psychological impact. The third phase of Marcus's strategy required more direct risks, but promised greater intelligence gathering opportunities. Using skills developed during months of preparation, he managed to place surveillance devices in locations where family members and associates conducted business. The technical challenges were significant, but Marcus's engineering background provided solutions that less technically skilled adversaries would have found impossible to implement. The intelligence gathered through these surveillance operations revealed information that fundamentally changed Marcus's understanding of Sarah's disappearance and his own situation. The mysterious journalist who had recruited Sarah was not working for any legitimate news organization or law enforcement agency. Instead, Tony was Anthony Castellano, a low-level associate of the Rossi organization who had been tasked with identifying potential threats to family operations. Sarah hadn't been recruited to investigate the Rossi family. She had been identified as someone conducting suspicious activities around their businesses, and then manipulated into revealing the extent of her knowledge and the identity of anyone who might be directing her surveillance. The photography project that Sarah believed was journalistic investigation had actually been an interrogation technique designed to determine whether she represented a serious threat or was simply an innocent college student with poor judgment. The recording that provided this revelation was devastating in its implications. Sarah had been killed not because she had discovered dangerous information, but because her handler's true identity couldn't be verified and the organization couldn't risk exposure if she was actually working for law enforcement or rival criminal groups. The decision had been made during one of the warehouse meetings Marcus had been monitoring, discussed with the same clinical detachment that might be applied to any business problem requiring resolution. But the recordings also revealed something else that changed everything about Marcus's mission. Sarah's body had been disposed of in a way that would make recovery impossible, but her personal effects, including items of significant sentimental value, were being retained as insurance against potential future complications. Vincent Rossi Jr., personally maintained these items in a secure location, partly as trophies and partly as evidence that could be used to implicate others if law enforcement pressure ever became too intense. This information transformed Marcus's campaign from a desperate search for his missing daughter into something much darker and more focused. Sarah was dead, murdered by people who considered her life a minor inconvenience to be eliminated, with no more thought than they would give to replacing a broken piece of equipment. But her killers had made the mistake of keeping evidence of their crime, and Marcus now knew exactly who was responsible and where proof of their guilt could be found. The psychological transformation that had been building over months of investigation and preparation crystallized into something harder and more dangerous. Marcus was no longer searching for his daughter. He was preparing to deliver justice to the people who had killed her. The methodical approach that had characterized his campaign would continue, but the objectives had fundamentally changed. Vincent Rossi Jr. had murdered Marcus's daughter and kept her personal effects as trophies. The organization had corrupted official investigations through political influence and legal manipulation. They had assumed that Marcus represented the same kind of manageable problem they had been resolving for decades through established procedures and proven methods. Marcus spent the following weeks planning an operation that would demonstrate just how wrong those assumptions were. The man who had filed a missing person report 8 months earlier no longer existed. In his place was someone who understood his enemy's capabilities, had studied their weaknesses, and was prepared to show them that some problems couldn't be resolved through the usual methods. The peripheral pressure campaign had served its purpose, forcing the organization to reveal information and vulnerabilities that would have remained hidden otherwise. But the next phase would require direct action against people who had spent their entire careers avoiding the consequences of their choices. Marcus had learned their rules, studied their methods, and prepared countermeasures for their likely responses. The hunter had identified his prey, understood their defenses, and chosen his weapons. What came next would test whether decades of unopposed criminal activity had made the Rossi organization as invulnerable as they believed, or whether a father's grief could become something powerful enough to bring them down. Winter was ending, but for Vincent Rossi Jr. and his associates, something much darker was beginning. Marcus Chen had evolved from victim to predator, and the lessons he had learned over months of careful preparation were about to be applied with precision and devastating effect. The war that began with Sarah's disappearance was entering its final phase, and only one side fully understood what was at stake. Marcus had found his daughter, or at least learned her fate. Now it was time to ensure that the people responsible paid the appropriate price for what they had done. The mechanical engineer who had always trusted in systems and procedures was about to demonstrate what happened when those systems failed and someone decided to create their own justice. The hunting season was about to begin. Spring arrived in Cleveland with an unseasonable warmth that felt like nature's cruel mockery of Marcus Chen's internal winter. It had been nearly a year since Sarah's disappearance, and the man who emerged from his months of preparation bore little resemblance to the grieving father who had first walked into the 3rd District Police Station. The mechanical engineer who had once measured success in terms of family stability and honest work had been replaced by something infinitely more dangerous, a predator who understood his prey's weaknesses and was prepared to exploit them without mercy or hesitation. The intelligence gathered through months of surveillance had provided Marcus with a complete picture of the Rossi organization's structure, operations, and most importantly, their vulnerabilities. But knowledge alone was insufficient for what he planned to accomplish. Justice for Sarah's murder required more than understanding his enemies. It required dismantling them piece by piece until they faced the same helplessness and terror that Sarah had experienced in her final moments. Marcus's final preparation phase involved acquiring resources that weren't readily available through legitimate channels. His engineering background provided access to industrial chemicals and equipment that could be repurposed for his needs, while his growing understanding of criminal psychology helped him identify suppliers who asked few questions about unusual purchases. The man who had once worked within every legal framework was learning to navigate markets that operated entirely outside legitimate oversight. The psychological preparation was equally important. Through months of surveillance and intelligence gathering, Marcus had documented not just the criminal activities that had led to Sarah's death, but also the casual cruelty with which the Rossi organization operated. The recordings from their warehouse meetings revealed an organization that treated human suffering as a business expense, discussing murders and intimidation with the same detached professionalism that legitimate businesses applied to quarterly earnings reports. Vincent Rossi Jr. in particular had demonstrated a callousness that transcended normal criminal behavior. The recordings captured him discussing Sarah's death as an inconvenience that had been resolved efficiently, showing more concern about potential law enforcement attention than about taking an innocent life. He had personally overseen the disposal of Sarah's body and kept her jewelry as trophies, displaying the kind of casual sadism that revealed fundamental psychological defects beneath his sophisticated businessman facade. Marcus's campaign began in earnest on a Tuesday morning in April, exactly 11 months after Sarah's disappearance. The first target was Anthony Castellano, the man who had manipulated Sarah into the surveillance activities that led to her death. Castellano lived in a modest apartment in Cleveland Heights and worked part-time at one of the family's legitimate businesses while handling various special projects that required more discretion than normal employees could provide. The operation required 3 weeks of careful preparation to establish Castellano's routines, identify his vulnerabilities, and create opportunities for approach. Marcus had learned that Castellano was a creature of habit who followed predictable patterns. The same morning coffee shop, the same route to work, the same evening bar where he met associates and conducted business. This predictability, which probably provided Castellano with a sense of security and control, became the weakness that Marcus exploited. The approach happened on a Thursday evening as Castellano left Mahoney's Tavern after his weekly meeting with 2 other Rossi associates. Marcus had been tracking these meetings for months, understanding that they served as informal briefings where lower-level operatives reported on various ongoing activities and received instructions for upcoming projects. The parking lot behind the tavern was poorly lit and isolated from street traffic, providing ideal conditions for the kind of private conversation Marcus intended to have. Castellano never saw the attack coming. One moment he was walking toward his car, probably thinking about whatever criminal activities occupied his evening plans, and the next, he was unconscious in the back seat of Marcus's van, secured with restraints that his engineering background had specifically designed for this purpose. The entire operation took less than 90 seconds and left no witnesses or evidence that would complicate later phases of Marcus's campaign. The interrogation that followed took place in a storage facility that Marcus had prepared specifically for this purpose, located in an industrial area where screams wouldn't attract attention and where chemical disposal could be managed without environmental consequences. Castellano regained consciousness to find himself immobilized in a chair, facing a man whose appearance and demeanor suggested that his previous assumptions about personal safety had been dangerously optimistic. "You're going to tell me everything about what happened to Sarah Chen," Marcus said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made resistance seem both futile and dangerous. "You're going to explain exactly how you manipulated her, who gave the orders for her death and where her body was disposed of. And you're going to do this because the alternative is much worse than anything you've previously imagined." What followed was 6 hours of systematic interrogation that revealed details about Sarah's final days that no official investigation could have uncovered. Castellano, faced with pain and fear that transcended anything his criminal career had prepared him for, provided information that filled in every gap in Marcus's understanding of his daughter's murder. Sarah had been identified as a potential threat during routine security sweeps of businesses in Little Italy. Her photography activities had been noticed by several associates, and her questions about Vincent Rossi had been reported through normal channels. Rather than simply warning her away, the organization had decided to determine whether she represented a more serious threat by having Castellano pose as a journalist and gather intelligence about her knowledge and possible connections to law enforcement. The manipulation had been expertly executed, playing on Sarah's idealism and desire to contribute to meaningful work. Castellano had convinced her that she was helping expose corruption and criminal activity, never revealing that she was actually being interrogated by the very organization she thought she was investigating. The photography assignments had been designed to test her knowledge and determine whether she had been professionally trained in surveillance techniques. When it became clear that Sarah was an amateur acting independently, rather than a trained operative, the organization faced a decision about how to manage the security risk she represented. Vincent Rossi Jr. had argued for permanent resolution, pointing out that Sarah had gathered enough photographic evidence to potentially compromise several operations if she ever decided to contact law enforcement or journalists. The decision to kill her had been made during one of the warehouse meetings Marcus had been monitoring, approved by Vincent Rossi Sr. and implemented by his son with characteristic efficiency. Sarah had been told to meet Castellano at a location near the lake for a final briefing about her photography project. Instead, she had been taken to the warehouse facility where Vincent Jr. personally conducted a final interrogation to ensure she hadn't shared information with anyone else. When satisfied that Sarah represented no ongoing threat to family operations, he had killed her with clinical detachment, treating her death as a routine business problem that required resolution. Her body had been disposed of using methods that the family had perfected over decades of criminal activity: chemical dissolution that left no recoverable remains, followed by disposal in locations that would never be searched. Sarah's personal effects had been kept by Vincent Jr., they partly as insurance and partly as trophies representing his power over life and death in his territory. The information that Castellano provided under duress filled Marcus with a rage that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained self-control. His daughter had died not because she had discovered dangerous secrets or posed a serious threat, but because her innocent curiosity had intersected with the paranoid security procedures of an organization that considered murder a routine business expense. She had been killed by people who felt no more remorse about ending her life than they would about discarding a broken piece of equipment. But Marcus's months of preparation had taught him that rage without discipline was merely destructive emotion. The systematic approach that had characterized his investigation would continue to guide his actions, even as the objectives shifted from gathering intelligence to delivering justice. Castellano had provided the final pieces of information needed to target the people directly responsible for Sarah's death, but he had also served another purpose, demonstrating that the organization's apparent invulnerability could be breached by someone with sufficient motivation and preparation. Castellano's disappearance was discovered the following day when he failed to appear for a scheduled meeting with Vincent Jr. and other associates. The body that was eventually found provided a clear message about the kind of enemy the Rossi organization was now facing. Marcus had arranged the scene to demonstrate that their security assumptions were no longer valid, while simultaneously providing evidence that would complicate any official investigation into Castellano's death. The immediate response was predictable: increased security measures, modified operational procedures, and intensive efforts to identify the source of the threat. But Marcus had anticipated these reactions and prepared countermeasures that would turn the organization's defensive responses into additional vulnerabilities. Every security upgrade created new patterns that could be studied and exploited, while the psychological pressure of facing an unknown enemy began to erode the confidence and discipline that held the organization together. The second phase of Marcus's campaign targeted K1ll Rossi, Vincent Jr., as younger brother who managed the family's construction and waste management operations. K1ll's role in Sarah's death had been indirect. He had participated in the decision-making process, but hadn't personally implemented the murder. This distinction was irrelevant to Marcus, who understood that organizational responsibility extended to everyone who had the power to prevent Sarah's death, but chose not to exercise it. K1ll's capture required more sophisticated planning than Castellano's, reflecting his higher position in the family hierarchy and correspondingly better security arrangements. But Marcus had spent months studying K1ll's routines and had identified a vulnerability that even professional security consultants had overlooked: his weekly visits to a massage therapy clinic that catered to clients who valued discretion above conventional medical credentials. The operation took place on a Wednesday afternoon, when Michael's security detail was occupied with other responsibilities, and his personal protection was reduced to a single driver who remained with the vehicle. Marcus had spent weeks establishing relationships with clinic staff, presenting himself as a potential client while gathering intelligence about security procedures and operational schedules. When the moment came, his approach was so smooth and professional that witnesses would later struggle to provide useful descriptions to investigators. Michael Rossi regained consciousness in the same storage facility where Castellano had provided his final testimony, though the scene had been modified to reflect lessons learned from the previous interrogation. The restraint system was more sophisticated, the chemical disposal arrangements were more efficient, and the psychological pressure techniques had been refined based on understanding how different personality types responded to various forms of persuasion. The conversation that followed lasted 12 hours and provided Marcus with intelligence that fundamentally changed his understanding of the Rossi organization's operations and vulnerabilities. Michael, faced with evidence of what had happened to Castellano, and understanding that his own survival depended on complete cooperation, revealed details about family operations that decades of law enforcement investigation had never uncovered. The waste management and construction businesses that formed the backbone of the family's legitimate operations were far more extensively integrated with illegal activities than Marcus had previously understood. The construction company's access to municipal projects provided opportunities for money laundering, bid rigging, and the creation of hidden facilities used for sensitive activities. The waste management operation offered disposal services for materials that couldn't be handled through normal channels, while the fleet of specialized vehicles provided mobile platforms for surveillance and communication that were effectively invisible to law enforcement monitoring. More importantly, Michael revealed the extent of the family's political and law enforcement connections. The systematic obstruction that Marcus had encountered during his initial search for Sarah wasn't simply bureaucratic inefficiency. It was the result of carefully cultivated relationships with officials who ensured that investigations into family activities were conducted with minimal enthusiasm and maximum procedural obstacles. The protection extended from municipal-level politics to federal law enforcement agencies, creating layers of insulation that had allowed the organization to operate with virtual impunity for decades. The intelligence about political corruption was particularly valuable because it explained why conventional justice systems had proven inadequate to address Sarah's murder. The same officials who should have been investigating the Rossi organization were instead ensuring that such investigations remained superficial and ineffective. Marcus's campaign wasn't simply fighting criminal organization. It was confronting a network of corruption that extended throughout Cleveland's political and law enforcement establishments. But Michael also revealed information that provided Marcus with new opportunities for applying pressure to the organization. The family's success had created dependencies and obligations that could be exploited by someone who understood their financial and political relationships. Legitimate business operations that were essential to the organization's money laundering activities could be disrupted through regulatory challenges and competitive pressure. Political relationships that provided protection could be compromised if the officials involved were faced with scandals that threatened their own survival. Most importantly, Michael confirmed details about Vincent Jr.'s personal role in Sarah's death and the location where her personal effects were being kept. This information transformed Marcus's campaign from systematic harassment of criminal organization into focused pursuit of the specific individuals who had murdered his daughter and the evidence that proved their guilt. The psychological impact of Michael's disappearance on the remaining family members was exactly what Marcus had intended. Two key family operatives had been eliminated in ways that demonstrated sophisticated planning and detailed knowledge of organizational security procedures. The unknown enemy had proven capable of penetrating defenses that had protected the family for decades, while simultaneously gathering intelligence that could compromise their entire operation. Vincent Rossi Sr., the family patriarch, responded by implementing security measures that were unprecedented in their scope and expense. Private security firms were retained, operational procedures were completely revised, and family members were relocated to secure facilities while the threat was identified and eliminated. But these defensive measures came at enormous cost, both financial and operational, while providing security that was more theoretical than practical against an enemy who had already demonstrated his ability to breach their previous defenses. The pressure was particularly intense on Vincent Jr., who bore direct responsibility for the murders that had triggered Marcus's campaign. The recordings from warehouse meetings revealed growing tension between father and son, with Vincent Sr. questioning the decisions that had exposed the organization to this unprecedented threat. The systematic elimination of trusted associates had created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that made normal operations increasingly difficult to maintain. Marcus exploited this psychological pressure through a campaign of targeted harassment that kept Vincent Jr. in a constant state of anxiety and fear. Anonymous messages provided details about his daily activities that demonstrated ongoing surveillance capabilities. His vehicles were sabotaged in ways that caused mechanical failures at inconvenient moments. His homes and offices were subjected to break-ins that left no evidence of theft, but provided clear proof that his security was inadequate to prevent intrusion. The cumulative effect was a systematic erosion of Vincent Jr.'s confidence and authority within the organization. The man who had casually ordered Sarah's death was learning what it felt like to live in constant fear of an enemy whose capabilities and intentions remained unknown. The psychological torture that Marcus implemented was precise and relentless, designed to create the same sense of helplessness and terror that Sarah must have experienced during her final hours. The campaign reached its climax on a Friday evening in late June, exactly 14 months after Sarah's disappearance. Marcus had used the intelligence provided by K1ll Rossi to identify the location where Vincent Jr. was keeping Sarah's personal effects, a private storage facility that the family used for materials that were too sensitive to keep in normal business locations. The facility was heavily secured and monitored, but Marcus's months of preparation had identified vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with his technical skills and unlimited motivation. The operation required 6 months of planning and preparation, involving the systematic compromise of security systems, the placement of surveillance equipment, and the development of access routes that would allow approach and escape without detection. Marcus had studied every aspect of the facility's operations, from guard schedules to alarm system protocols, creating a plan that accounted for every possible contingency and response. The break-in itself was a masterpiece of technical precision that demonstrated just how far Marcus had evolved from the desperate father who had begun this campaign over a year earlier. Using equipment and techniques that would have impressed professional intelligence operatives, he penetrated multiple layers of security without triggering a single alarm or leaving any evidence of intrusion. The storage unit that contained Sarah's effects was located and accessed with surgical precision, revealing the trophies that Vincent Jr. had kept as reminders of his power over life and death. Sarah's jewelry, her cell phone, her wallet with family photos, all the personal items that had been missing from her abandoned car were arranged in a display case like museum artifacts. Vincent Jr. had kept them as souvenirs of successful murder, physical reminders of his ability to eliminate problems without consequences. The sight of these items, preserved like trophies from a hunting expedition, filled Marcus with a rage so pure and focused that it temporarily overwhelmed his capacity for rational thought. But the storage unit contained more than just Sarah's effects. Vincent Jr. had also kept detailed records of other murders and crimes that the family had committed over the years, apparently as insurance against potential betrayal by associates or family members. The documents revealed decades of criminal activity that included dozens of murders, extensive corruption of public officials, and criminal enterprises that extended far beyond Cleveland into neighboring states and major metropolitan areas. Marcus photographed everything, creating a complete record of evidence that could destroy not just Vincent Jr., but the entire Rossi organization and their network of corrupt officials. But he also took something else from the storage unit, items that would serve a very different purpose in the final phase of his campaign. Sarah's jewelry would be returned to Vincent Jr. personally, along with a message that would leave no doubt about the source of the threat he had been facing. The confrontation that Marcus had been planning for over a year finally took place on a Saturday night at Vincent Jr.'s secure residence in Shaker Heights. The estate was protected by sophisticated security systems and a professional guard service, but Marcus had been studying the property for months and had identified multiple ways to penetrate its defenses. The approach he chose was direct and brutal, designed to demonstrate that Vincent Jr., his assumptions about safety and security were no longer valid. Vincent Jr. found himself face to face with Sarah's father in the study of his own home, surrounded by the luxury that his criminal career had purchased, confronted by evidence of the crimes that had funded his lifestyle. Marcus had arranged the scene carefully, with Sarah's jewelry displayed prominently and photographs of the storage unit's contents scattered across the desk like evidence in a courtroom. "You're going to explain to me exactly what happened to my daughter," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 14 months preparing for this moment. "You're going to tell me about her final hours, about what she said before you killed her, about whether she understood what was happening to her. And you're going to do this because you finally understand that your money and connections and security can't protect you from someone who has nothing left to lose." What followed was a conversation that lasted until dawn, during which Vincent Jr. provided details about Sarah's murder that filled in the final gaps in Marcus's understanding. Sarah had maintained her innocence until the end, insisting that she was just a college student who had been trying to help with what she believed was legitimate journalism. She had begged for her life, offered to forget everything she had seen, promised that she would never contact authorities or cause problems for the organization. Vincent Jr. had ignored her pleas because he understood that loose ends created vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities eventually became threats that required elimination. He had killed her without emotion or hesitation, treating her death as a routine business decision that protected family interests. The casual cruelty with which he described her final moments confirmed everything that Marcus had learned about the organization's fundamental lack of humanity. But the conversation also revealed something else that changed Marcus's understanding of his own situation and objectives. Vincent Jr.'s death wouldn't end the threat to other innocent people who might inadvertently cross paths with the Rossi organization. The network of corruption that protected their operations would continue to function. The political relationships that ensured impunity would remain intact, and other families would eventually face the same loss and helplessness that Marcus had experienced. The realization that justice for Sarah required more than revenge against her immediate killers led Marcus to a decision that would define the remainder of his life. The evidence he had gathered over months of investigation wasn't just useful for identifying the people responsible for Sarah's death. It was sufficient to destroy the entire criminal organization and the network of corruption that enabled their operations. Vincent Jr.'s body was discovered the following Monday morning in a location that ensured maximum publicity and official attention. The scene had been arranged to provide clear evidence of the crimes that had led to his death, with copies of documents from the storage unit arranged around the body and Sarah's jewelry placed prominently where investigators couldn't miss its significance. The message was clear. Someone with extensive knowledge of family operations had delivered justice for crimes that official systems had been unable or unwilling to address. The investigation that followed Vincent Jr. His murder led to revelations that destroyed not just the Rossi organization, but the entire network of corruption that had protected their operations for decades. The evidence that Marcus had gathered and strategically released through anonymous tips provided law enforcement agencies with detailed documentation of crimes that spanned multiple jurisdictions and involved dozens of public officials. Federal prosecutors used the evidence to build racketeering cases that resulted in convictions of over 40 individuals, including Vincent Rossi Sr., multiple family associates, and corrupt officials at every level of government, from municipal politics to federal law enforcement agencies. The construction and waste management businesses were seized and liquidated, their assets used to compensate victims of family crimes and fund programs designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. Detective Kowalski, one of the few law enforcement officials who had conducted Sarah's investigation with genuine commitment rather than superficial compliance with procedural requirements, was promoted to head a new task force focused on organized crime and political corruption. The evidence provided through anonymous channels had given him the tools needed to pursue cases that had previously been impossible to build, transforming him from a frustrated investigator into one of the most effective prosecutors of organized crime in federal law enforcement. Marcus Chen disappeared from Cleveland shortly after Vincent Jr.'s death, leaving behind a house that was sold through estate attorneys and a manufacturing job that was filled by someone who asked fewer questions about missing persons cases and police corruption. The man who had filed a missing person report 18 months earlier no longer existed, replaced by someone who understood that some problems required solutions that couldn't be implemented through legal channels or conventional justice systems. Linda Chen received a letter postmarked from Seattle, informing her that Marcus had found the truth about Sarah's death and ensured that justice had been delivered to the people responsible. The letter included detailed information about Sarah's final days and the location where her remains could be found, allowing Linda to finally lay their daughter to rest with dignity and closure. Marcus's letter also included instructions for accessing financial accounts that would ensure Linda's security for the rest of her life, along with an explanation that he could never return to the life they had shared because the man she had married was gone forever. The story that emerged from the investigation and prosecutions that followed Vincent Jr.'s death became a case study in how organized crime could be defeated by someone willing to operate outside conventional systems and accept personal costs that most people would find unacceptable. Law enforcement agencies studied Marcus's methods, while criminologists analyzed the psychological transformation that had enabled an ordinary father to systematically destroy a criminal organization that had operated with impunity for decades. But the most important lesson was simpler and more personal. When institutions fail to protect innocent people from predators, when corruption and political influence create immunity from consequences, when bureaucratic procedures become shields for criminal behavior, sometimes justice requires individuals who are willing to sacrifice everything to ensure that evil doesn't triumph through the simple expedient of institutional protection. Marcus Chen had learned that lesson at a cost that no parent should ever have to pay. His daughter was dead, his marriage was destroyed, and his previous life was completely gone. But Sarah's killers had faced appropriate consequences for their crimes. Dozens of other potential victims had been protected from similar fates, and a network of corruption that had operated for decades had been permanently dismantled. The mechanical engineer who had once believed in working within systems had discovered that some problems required solutions that no system could provide. In finding justice for his daughter's murder, Marcus had become something that the old Marcus would have found frightening and incomprehensible. But he had also ensured that Sarah's death had meaning beyond simple tragedy, that her life had been honored through actions that protected other innocent people from similar fates. The hunter had completed his work, delivering justice to predators who had assumed their power made them untouchable. The cost had been everything that Marcus had previously valued about his life, but the results had validated his transformation from victim to predator, from someone who accepted institutional failure to someone who created his own solutions to problems that conventional systems couldn't address. In the end, Marcus Chen had learned the hardest lesson that any parent can face. Sometimes love requires becoming something that love itself would find difficult to recognize. But he had also learned that such transformations, however personally devastating, could serve purposes larger than individual grief and more important than personal survival. The Mafia hunter had found his prey, delivered appropriate justice, and disappeared into a world where people like Vincent Rossi Jr. learned to fear the consequences of their choices. It was not the ending that Marcus had wanted for his life, but it was the ending that justice for Sarah's murder had required, and that was sufficient to justify everything that had been lost in the pursuit of truth and accountability. The hunt was over. The prey had been eliminated, and somewhere in America, a father who no longer existed had ensured that his daughter's death would never be forgotten, and that the people responsible would face appropriate consequences for their crimes, regardless of how powerful they believed themselves to be.